is I'm going to take you through a timeline of early church events. And as we go through, we'll hit a couple events, a couple people. But I want to make this a bit of a communal effort right now. And if there's something that you remember that was encouraging, impressive, concerning regarding whatever it is that I jumped to, then you kind of just throw up the hand and we'll talk about it a little bit. So here's what we'll do is I'm going to show you this timeline right now. And this timeline actually takes us all the way through church history. And I actually have almost every event of some sort of significance on this timeline. We'll be using it all throughout the 2 days that we are together. And as we do so, it's an interesting timeline because it kind of shifts out. So you can see it kind of ups out, and then each event kind of swings on out, and you get a bit of a dimension of knowing whether stuff was happening in a more compressed period of time or not. And I like the way that this thing helps us to see that. So as the New Testament is coming to a close, some of the last books happen around the time of Nero's persecution. And just to get a bit of a dimension on that, what books do you think were written around the time of Nero's persecution of 64 to 68? Just raise a hand. Let me think. Well, I said Hebrews, so good job, Jack. You got that one. He was listening moments ago. I appreciate that. So, very good. Phil? Revelation, yeah. Revelation may have been written actually during the next persecution of 95. But it surrounds the events of Nero's persecution, though, for sure. Any other books?
First and Second Peter?
First and Second Peter, for sure.
Remember Paul's writings talked about it.
Yeah, First, Second Timothy would be around this time, for sure. Titus likely during this time, too.
Possibly Mark.
So, I think Mark was earlier, personally. Because it would have been before probably Peter went to Rome, because Mark would have had access to him earlier than that. It's during this time that both Peter and Paul are executed in Rome. Anybody have any knowledge of Nero's persecution, some of the things that went on during that time?
The animal skins, is that part of that?
Yeah.
The animal skins, putting them alive in animal skins.
Yeah, he would encase them in animal skins for really his own personal pleasure at that point, just to see animals come and rip them up. Yeah.
Using them as torches for their parties.
Lighting the gardens after dark. He'd cover them with tar and pitch and light them afire.
He lit the fire himself personally to expand his own.
We don't know that, but it may be that either he wanted to see the slums of Rome burned. We don't know if he lit it personally or if he even knew how to play the fiddle, but
tradition.
He did try to blame it on the Christians.
Absolutely.
And as a result, for sure we have that part in public record. The big event following that, and really almost concurrent with that in some ways, is the fall of Jerusalem. It falls after Nero's gone, but it begins under the siege of Domitian and Titus. And it ultimately is brought down by Titus, who completes the siege in 70 AD. This is a frieze. A frieze is kind of a relief carved out of rock of a great arch in Rome commemorating the event. And we'll talk about that. But it's interesting that in that frieze you can see the lampstand that would be in the holy place, and as well as the table of showbread that would have been in the holy place. And in addition to that, along the frieze are depicted the spoils of war, which would have included 20,000 Jewish slaves that were brought into Rome and marched in a triumphal procession right down the Sacred Way, down the Palatine Hill, and right through the Roman Forum. Domitian is the next great persecution. In between Nero and Domitian, there's a bit of a time of calm, because many perceived Nero's persecutions not to be for the public good, but to be for his own warped entertainment. And as a result, there was a bit of a blowback, is the perception, by which others had no more taste for that. However, Domitian is regarded as Nero Redivivus. And in other words, he's this kind of Nero Redux, or Nero Part 2 that comes on the scene, and a lot of his ugly persecution is very similar to what Nero did. Moving on, in 85 AD, we're still rather early, we have the publication of the Didache. Anybody read the Didache? What's something that you saw in the Didache that was of interest? Yeah.
That they studied the Bible with people before they got baptized. So it's a whole process of like bringing these people in and teaching them before they actually be baptized.
Yeah, there was no altar call of baptism. It was only after a thorough catechesis or catechism of the catechumens. That's the name of the students that were being prepared for baptism. Yeah.
They also, the methods of baptism.
Very detailed in there, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you have running water, great. That's your first choice. If you have cold water, yeah, that's even better than warm water. Still water, okay. If you don't have anything, still water. And if you have any of that, then you can kind of do the Gatorade plunge. Because the word baptism does mean to overwhelm. It's like an avalanche would baptize you. More appropriately, probably, than immersing yourself in water. But the idea of being overwhelmed by something. You're still completely buried. So the idea of burial with Christ is inherent in that. But anyway, that's all seen in the Didache. There's an odd thing about baptism, though, besides that in the Didache. Anybody read that? Pick up on it? It seems as though that they would have a triune baptism. And it would be a triple dunk. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And you see that at different times throughout the early church writings, which is interesting. There's another thing in the Didache that's interesting. It's the test for a false prophet. And you know what one of the tests was? If he stays more than 3 days. If he stays more than 3 days, chances are this guy's just a freeloader.
Yeah.
So, 94 to 96, John was exiled on Patmos. And I'm fresh from having just been on Patmos just 2 weeks ago. It was not an exile. It was one of the most beautiful things I ever experienced, was being there. And it really was inspiring. And it is there where he received the revelation, probably around 95. He was likely in Ephesus, and then later brought back to Ephesus, according to our church history documents that we have. So, moving on from there, now we are completely out of the biblical period as we turn the corner on 100. John may have lived to about the year 105, by the way, a very old man, the last of the apostles. And now, though, we're firmly out of the biblical period and in the ante-Nicene period. We call it the ante-Nicene period because the Council of Nicaea occurred in 325 AD. It's such a radical turning point that we recognize it as a stake in the ground for a significant change. In 112, Ignatius of Antioch is martyred. He writes letters to the churches in Turkey, including the Church of Ephesus. And in those letters, he actually writes quite vividly about what is coming his way. He was brought ultimately to Rome, where he was martyred in the Colosseum. He was a contemporary of Polycarp and of Papias. He was also a disciple of John. Yeah, so there's a pretty good connection there. Anybody encounter anything else about Ignatius? He does write quite a bit. Here's what I would encourage you to do, is a couple of these early church guys, because we have such great resources on them, pick one or two and decide to read the primary documents. There's nothing that launches you into a life of seeking knowledge like getting back to the sources, getting back to the primary sources. Yeah, Josh.
Yeah, I noticed that these young guys, excuse me, early church fathers, they put it seemed like a lot of stock in martyrdom.
A lot of stock in what? Martyrdom.
Yeah.
Ignatius in particular.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you bring that up, because he is, in some circles, accused of creating a cult of the martyrs. Because in his writings, he says, in these letters that he writes on his way to Rome, and by the way, on his way to Rome, it's recorded that disciples, those letters must have circulated ahead of him, because disciples were greeting him all along the way. And there must have been some really great network of communication throughout the church for the disciples to constantly be greeting him all the way on his way to Rome. Often it was the bishop of the church, the leader of the church, that was being persecuted unto death. But Polycarp in his writing says, bring on the crushing of bones,
Yeah,
the
I love
tearing of flesh,
You got
the
it.
wild beasts at your disposal. Bring them on. I look forward to this, only to attain unto Christ. It's rather heroic stuff that he writes. A lot of this, though, when you read their writings, he will say some really intense things regarding the church and even persecution. But we've got to recognize that it's being said in a context. And if it's your last few words that you're writing, or you're trying to encourage people, you might use some rather ornate language, or perhaps even things that have more of an edge to them. So we've got to try to give them a little bit of leeway in trying to understand how they were writing. Again, none of this stuff makes it into the Bible because it's not inspired. But nonetheless, it's pretty good stuff that helps to inform us. Trajan, he is the guy who brought down Jerusalem, by the way. And when he becomes emperor after Domitian, he brings on persecution from 112 to 117, and it is under that time that Ignatius is martyred. After that, Hadrian becomes emperor. His persecution lasts from 117 to 138. And it's varied, though. All of these persecutions that I'm mentioning earlier, they tend to be more extreme in the east, less so in the west and the north. So, for example, in Gaul, France, and Italy, Rome, that area, it doesn't seem as though it was as intense. There was such a melting pot in that area. I think everybody just kind of had a let bygones be bygones in that sense of tolerance. But further east, especially where Christianity had more influence, in some cases the governors who might have been over those areas might have found it to be more expedient for them to actually enforce certain prescriptives that may have come from Rome to a greater degree than you would have in other areas. Yeah, Josh. Mike.
On the downloaded slide, some of the dates are a little off. Is that?
You know what? Whatever we'll do, we'll actually reload them. Are you looking at a slide that looks like this at all? Yeah, I actually altered this a bit, so I'll reload this thing. And I tried to convert this thing over to slides. It wasn't easy to do. But anyway, 150 is a time where you see the apologists really rising up. The reason being that we need apologists is not because they were stepping on so many people's toes and needing to apologize, but because there were so many heresies that now began to crop up. Mm-hmm. What was the heresy that began to really flame up at this period of time? Yeah, Gnosticism. And Justin Martyr is converted by an older man, and it's a rather impressive conversion that he has. Does anybody remember reading about his conversion at all? Yeah, what do you remember about it, Drew?
Justin was a philosopher, and that I guess someone was following him or talking to him and asking some questions about kind of the cosmos and life and philosophical questions, and they began to speak, and he began to be intrigued. And then even after he was converted, he continued wearing his robes, his philosopher robes.
I think he ultimately does drop his philosopher robes at one point. But yeah, he was a philosopher in the school of Pythagoras. Not just that he was really good at a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but Pythagoras had actually he actually had a whole school of a system of philosophy. He also engaged in some Platonic philosophy as well. Not meaning that he had this girl that he was good friends with, but he actually engaged with Plato's idea of dualism and spirit, and a lot of that was even close to Gnosticism. But as Drew said, it was a very humble older man that simply engaged him in conversation and tore down all of his arguments and was able to help him to see the real logic, the real truth, the real logos. Philosophers were quite intrigued all throughout the classical age of Greece with the idea of logos. Gnosticism was likewise engaged with logos. It becomes a very important term, and it is one that the Christians were able to use to leverage against not only these heresies, but to help people see who might have found some truth, and there is some truth in good philosophy, but that truth was actually there because of the true logos that they would ultimately introduce people to. Well, during this time of heresy, Marcion comes on the scene. Anybody know what Marcion did? Besides Matt, because he sat through the lectures. And he would have known anyway, because he sat through the class.
Right.
But Marcion's an important figure, and he figures rather large in something that affects us to today. Marcion was a Gnostic. Was that?
Universalism?
It's not universalism, but because he's a Gnostic, he actually makes a list of a canon of books that he deems to be actually inspired. And they only include bits of Luke's gospel and some of John's letters. No, I'm sorry, not John's letters, Paul's letters. Why would he not include anything from John?
Because it's physical.
Exactly. What we have seen, what we have handled, what we have touched. The Word, the Logos became flesh.
That's right.
And Gnosticism was a horrible influence in Christianity, in that in some estimates, a third of the early church may have actually apostatized over to forms of Gnosticism.
Wow.
And Gnosticism held to this idea that there is the true God, but then there are these emanations from this true God of, kind of a God that was created by that God, a God created by that God. And somewhere along the line of this long continuation of emanations from that God is a God that is described somewhat as a demigod, and ultimately this demigod, by a strange, perfect storm of unhappy coincidences, creates the world and allows it to be a world of matter and physical material, which they deem to be evil, and that the only thing that was really true and right is the spiritual. And so, of course, that idea leads to two different approaches to living our lives on earth. One is libertine, and that is, well, if I'm just kind of transcendent spiritually, who cares what I do with my flesh? Pass me the bong. They didn't have bongs then, but it would be that sort of an idea. I'm like, why not? Why not engage in debauchery? It's just the flesh, and after all, I'm well above the flesh.
Of course.
Or it could have led to an ascetic practice, where the flesh is evil and it needs to be, kind of whipped into submission. And so, there's a self-flagellation that would have occurred in that idea, and to bring the flesh under control. Stoicism was also somewhat engaged in that idea too, of bringing things under control. So anyway, but Marcion, engaged in Gnosticism, deemed only certain books to be books of the Bible. Now, prior to Marcionism, that wasn't as much of a case, and then the church was going to have to respond. And I'll talk more about that. 156, there's two different dates for the martyrdom of Polycarp. Some say 156 and others say somewhere around maybe 166. Because some accounts say he was martyred under Marcus Aurelius, who's the next emperor who brings on persecution. Others say it was prior to Marcus Aurelius, but we'll leave that as it is. But Polycarp was martyred. Anybody know where he was martyred? He was bishop of Smyrna. So, and it may have been actually near there, and we have the accounts, in they're plentiful. If all you've ever read, by the way, is the intro to the Real Heretics account, it would be interesting for you to actually read the primary source account from it. Has anybody actually gone to the primary source and read the account of the death of? It's actually called Thanatos, the death of Polycarp. Anybody, have you read?
Yeah, but it was a while ago. But I really got into it. It sounded different than.
It is different.
Than,
the ending is different.
Yeah.
It becomes more kind of fantastical. Well, he does all of that in both, So there's all of the, backing down the prefect or the governor with his strong stand. Kind of the bring it on attitude is the same. But after he says, "There's no need to bind me," the God who helped me to stand fast all these 86 years will also allow me to stand firm even in the flames. He does say that in the actual account. He was speared, but then after he was speared, then it gets a little bit fantastical, where his blood then spews out, and it comes out like a fire extinguisher, and it extinguishes all the flames in that story. So that's why it's really important not just to go off of some sort of a collection of stories, but as much as possible to get back to because what if you find yourself saying, "Oh my goodness, I'm so inspired by Polycarp, and it's so evident how really righteous and true the early church was," and somebody says, "Well, what do you think about that whole idea of his blood being a fire extinguisher?" and actually putting out all of the flames. I mean, do you really kind of hold to those kind of, fantastical, pieces to the account?
Right.
And then you're stuck with a humana. I didn't know it said that, really. So important that we're not just people that allow other people to spoon feed us, if we're really going to be those who really rise up, but we're going to be among those that, no, I'm going to get back and really look at the primary documents in all of this, and have a zeal for that. Read through, even when you have a chance, Proverbs 2, 3, 4, those chapters about the intensity by which we are to seek after knowledge and wisdom.
Right.
And to get after it as silver and gold with all that you want is to really seek after it. And Socrates has a great story attributed to him where he has a student that comes to him and wants to be his disciple. And Socrates says, well, what is it you seek? He says, I seek wisdom. And he says, well, how much do you really want wisdom? And he says, well, as much as I could imagine. And then the legend is that Socrates brings him down to the water and holds him under, and pulls him up. And he says, what is it that you want? He goes, I want wisdom. He goes, are you sure? He goes, yes. Holds him down further, pulls him up. What is it you want? He says, I want wisdom. Next time he holds him down now for over 2 minutes, pulls him up. He says, what is it you want? He goes, I just want air. And he says, well, when you want wisdom as much as you want air, then you will get wisdom. And that is the very idea of Proverbs 2, 3, and 4. And I think something that ought to cause us to think right now, am I just trying to get by for a test or a checking a box?
Right.
Or do I where we were just trying to get it over with? But I wasn't. I know Deb wasn't. I know a lot of the people that are our friends today, they were not at all. And thus they all went deeper. And where there was an opportunity to take it deeper and to learn more and to study extra, whatever it was, that was a gift.
Right.
And it was the greatest of all things that we could have. If you could really just grasp after that spirit, those are the folks that have actually sustained their faith and really gotten after things from that period of time. The box checkers, I didn't want to go through and tell you what all of that looks like. It's a sadder tale. All right, so moving on from Polycarp. 161 to 181 is a period of persecution under Marcus Aurelius. Does anybody have any kind of idea about Marcus Aurelius, who he was, what he was about as emperor?
Gladiator.
Besides the movie Gladiator? Well, somebody said philosopher. He's known as the philosopher king. He was a Stoic. That was his philosophy. He was an ardent Stoic, for sure. And actually admired by the early church, because he was the first emperor that actually seemed to have principles by which he lived his life, rather than just caprice or selfish appetites that guided them. But Marcus Aurelius was a sincere Stoic, and in Stoicism, the thing that you desired was to master your pathos, that your passions. And so when you say, wow, he's very Stoic, it's the Mr. Spock type idea, is kind of our characterization of Stoicism. And Marcus Aurelius, even though he did lead a very ordered life and a very admired man, even by the Christians, they soon didn't have a whole lot to admire him, because he had disdain for the passion of the Christians. And ultimately he felt it to be antithetical to what it was that he wanted to see in the empire. I'll just read here. He had no room in his cosmopolitan philanthropy for the purest and most innocent of his subjects, many of whom served in his own army. And there was a kind of a thunder squadron that was somewhat famous in the Roman army of Christians who actually did engage in battles, but one of the most effective tools that they had in battle, and you might have read this in Real Heretics, is that they simply prayed. Yeah. That they prayed for the empire, they prayed for the army, and they saw the hailstones come down and vanquish the enemy by trusting in God. However, they did engage in battle as well. Berceau, I think, selectively quotes about that particular regiment, because they actually did have quite success in battle, in actual battle too. But it doesn't kind of fit with the argument he was trying to make. Anyway, he was flooded with apologies, that is, defenses of the faith by influential people in the kingdom, including Athenagoras, in behalf of the persecuted Christians, but he turned a deaf ear to them. Only once in his meditations, that's the famous writings of Marcus Aurelius, does he even allude to the Christians, and only then with scorn, tracing their noble enthusiasm for martyrdom to sheer obstinacy and love for theatrical display. His excuse is ignorance. He probably never read a line of the New Testament or the defenses addressed to him. He belonged to a later Stoical school, which believed in the immediate absorption after death into the divine essence. Stoics believe that you have within you a little spark or a little flame, and upon death it is subsumed into the great divine conflagration. And that was a part of Stoicism. Because that was quite different, and it was also cyclical, he found the linear approach to Christianity, if he even knew much about it, in the immortality of the soul with its moral consequences as a vicious and dangerous to the welfare of the state. And so he passed a law punishing everyone with exile who would endeavor to influence people's minds by fear of divinity, and the law was aimed, even though it isn't precisely aimed at, it was no doubt aimed at Christians. There is a record of new decrees making it easier for Christians to be accused and having their property confiscated. And in 177, 48 Christians, it's one of the more famous martyrdoms that's captured in the annals of Christianity, were martyred in the amphitheater in Lyon. You're going to talk about that for a second, right? Yeah, so Deb will mention that. In 170, a big event is the Moratorian Canon. As I mentioned earlier, there was the 150 Canon of Marcion. As a response to that is the Moratorian Canon. Moratorian Canon is an interesting piece of document. It's a fragment that was found in 1748, I think, in a library in France. But it comes from a document that is dated to 170. We have some pretty good reliability of the dating of the document because of the events that are mentioned internally in the document. But in that document, it lists most of the books of the New Testament. And it even regards all of the writings of John. You know, some people think that the Gospel versus the Epistles versus the Revelation are written by different Johns. It even lists all of those as by the same John. That's quite encouraging. It lists the letters to Jude. It lists the letters to Peter. A lot of the books that some people felt like maybe they were fringe books, they're listed this early in the Moratorian Canon. The Montanist movement begins in 172. The Montanist movement begins up in an area north of Syria, north of where the 7 churches of Revelation are. If you can kind of picture that in a map, modern-day Turkey. The north end of that, just under, what is that? Is that the Black Sea up there? Caspian Sea? I forget my geography. But in that area there, the Montanist movement begins, and it spreads pretty rapidly, and it finds a deep footing in Carthage, which is North Africa. Those parts of the world were always, you know, like right now, or, you know, if you think of a German, you think of somebody who's, you know, disciplined and hardworking and they got their act together type of a deal. Well, that's kind of the idea of Phrygians as well, and Carthaginians, is that they were kind of the radical folks with most things, that they were very rigorous and disciplined about things. And it is in this area where perhaps the ethos of that culture is combined with Christianity, and Montanus, the guy's name, begins a movement within Christianity that goes after a more radical approach. They actually advocate martyrdom. And they also have this attitude of anything you can do, I can do better or more intensely. And so they were really holy. They were really rigorous. And it's also an influential movement because some of the martyrs that we admire, including Tertullian and Perpetua and Felicitas, they were actually either part of or highly influenced by this movement. But we got to be careful about it because in this movement were 2 women prophetesses. Anybody know who they were by any chance? Priscilla and Maximilla. Yes, exactly. Good job. And they prophesied the end of the world. And that Jesus would come down in the area of Phrygia and start the New Jerusalem. And as far as we can tell, they were wrong. So, false prophets. So you got to be careful. But they also were in an area where it was marked by pagan celebrations, including things like ecstatic utterances. where you kind of have these trance type experiences. So again, got to be careful that there's syncretism of what was going on in the culture, combining it with Christianity, and even though it may result in something more radical or rigorous, that is not always the basic standard bearer, and at some point it's life and doctrine, and in this case, for sure with doctrine, false prophecy definitely gives us a bit of a clue of how to regard them. Today's modern Pentecostals view the early church as having thrown out the baby with the bathwater when they condemned the Montanists as heretics.
Wow.
Because they felt like they were the true Christians who embraced the spontaneity and the power of the Holy Spirit, did not constrain the Holy Spirit, allowed the Holy Spirit to express himself through their lives. And when they were put down, they felt as though the church really did lose something. So it's an important movement to know something about, especially if you're working through with Pentecostals in any way. But by the way, in 212, Tertullian ends up in that movement. In 177, Irenaeus becomes Bishop of Lyon, and he combats heresies within the church. He's an important person to know because he was a disciple of Polycarp. Thank you. Yes, and he is known as a link in the chain to the apostles because he is the one who writes, I recall most vividly how the blessed Polycarp used to sit and discourse, and about his time of being taught by John. He writes that. So here we have the link, John, Polycarp, Irenaeus. And so Irenaeus writes a lot. Polycarp does not write a lot. If you're inspired to read more about Polycarp, well, you're going to have bupkis when you go searching for that. However, if you're really getting after early links in the chain, Irenaeus is a pretty good one there for you. He fought Gnosticism, wrote against heresies. That's a good book to read. And some of his writings are rather vivid. We'll do samplings of their writings in a little bit. 196, Tertullian begins writing. Anybody know what's unique about Tertullian's writings among the early church? It's what?
He was a lawyer, right?
He was, so he was a good at argumentation. Anything else regarding language?
Latin.
First one to speak in Latin. And so his writings had a bit more staying power because, of course, the church ended up deep in Latin. It was around this time, too, that Latin began to overtake Koine Greek as the common language, or lingua franca, as the term might imply, at the time. It's also important because at this time, Latin versions of the Bible began to crop up. And in those early Latin versions of the Bible, there were some things that began to pose trouble. And ultimately, 200 years later, Jerome is going to be commissioned to write a Bible in Latin. And some of the things that began as early as 170, 180, 190, as Latin began to eclipse Koine Greek, began back at this time. In 202, under Septimus Aurelius, there was a persecution that lasts from 202 to 210. And during that time, Perpetua and Felicitas are martyred. Deb will actually give us a session on that in just a minute. This mosaic is from a floor that actually depicts the martyrdoms that occurred during that time period. And you can see it is bloody and awful. It's actually celebrated, however, in the mosaic, which is a bit odd that anybody would actually want that on their floor. I don't know what public building would actually think, yeah, that's a great idea. We could have that. But he may have been not personally ill-disposed towards Christians, but because the church was gaining power and making so many powerful converts. I mean, and also the arguments were so good during this period of time. This is Tertullian, this is Justin Martyr, this is Irenaeus. This is where there's just the power of the Holy Spirit coming through these men to beat back the arguments of Gnosticism on all fronts very effectively, that there was more of a pushback. And especially in Carthage, Alexandria, Rome, and Corinth during that time. And as I mentioned, Perpetua came through at this time, and many of the students of Origen of Alexandria were martyred during this time. It's during this time, too, that Origen's tutor was martyred. Origen himself ran out hoping to be martyred with the rest of them, but he was a bit young, and they seem to have let him go. He begins writing in 205, and Jerome, who writes in 400, jokingly asks, has anyone even read everything that Origen wrote? He was that prolific a writer. But he did have two guys that followed him around at all times, recording everything that he said. No, he's very, very productive. He wrote a commentary on the whole New Testament. There's a lot of interesting things about him that we'll talk about when we go a bit deeper in him. Yeah, Jack?
I was just wondering, it says that the students of Origen were martyred, but then Origen begins writing in 205.
Oh, that period of time of Septimus Aurelius's persecution lasts all the way until 210.
Okay.
So you see there's like a bar that kind of goes further down there.
Yeah.
So it's at the further end of that
Okay.
is when his students are martyred. So anyway, good question. If it was just 202, you're right. You'd be like, aha, you made a mistake, Ed. Look at you now. But no.
I would do that.
No, it's not the case. At least not this part.
I do that.
212, 215. Nobody knows the exact date of this, so we're all kind of giving our best gauge here. But normally, if you have a gauge of when Tertullian's writings are, some people say be cautious around 212. 215 seems to be a date where he's clearly in the Montanist camp. And he writes things that are really radical. I mean, really radical. That not just a head covering, but a head covering that should go all the way down. Not just that you shouldn't, engage in the theater. You shouldn't even talk to anyone who's ever even been to the theater. I mean, he takes everything a step further, especially in his later writings when he converts to Montanism. Not so relevant. 232. Now, here's what's interesting at this point. The very first church archaeological evidence that we have comes from a home in Syria. The place is called Dura Europos, and it's 232. That's 200 years after Jesus. No church buildings. The first, and that's just a home where they knocked down a wall or two. And then Deb and I were just recently in Sardis, where there's this huge temple. And in the corner of this temple, and the temple's huge, it could have been one of the ancient wonders of the world if it had been completed, but it was never completed. But just like the Temple of Art, it was almost exactly like the Temple of Artemis would have been in Ephesus, but this one was in Sardis. But the scale, but there's more of it left. There's nothing left of the Artemis temple in Ephesus, but there's so much left of this temple, and the scale is immense. It's 300 feet long, 160 feet wide, and the columns they must be about 5-6 stories high. It's this huge structure, and in the corner of it is a tiny little church, and it's probably what we would be fitting in right now if we put walls around us real quick. And it is the very first church building that we found archaeologically where from the foundation up, it was built to be a church rather than a home that got converted. Right. And that's even later. That's in the 300s, maybe the early 300s for that building. So yeah, that idea of a kind of a big cathedral, much later. Yeah.
Are there markings that would distinguish it to be a church versus a home?
Oh, it's got all this one here?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I haven't been to that site. I haven't seen much about it other than.
But others would have the symbols?
Oh, all over the place. I mean, they would have, just a huge variety of crosses in different shapes that we saw in some of the spots where we got to actually rummage around and see the stones. So. Origen makes his way from Alexandria to Caesarea, back to Alexandria quite a bit. 232, this is 30 years later almost 30 years later after being teaching. But remember, he began teaching as a teenager. And so he has a long career in producing quite a bit of material. 235 to 251 is a persecution. This is a famous persecution because in it, and let me get to it in just a moment, during that time, Cyprian is the bishop of Carthage. He's very influential, and he seems to go underground during this persecution. And he survives it, despite the fact that a lot of church leaders didn't survive that persecution, especially in the Carthage, North Africa area. And right on the heels of that persecution comes Decius's persecution, and for the first time, it's empire-wide practiced. Every other time it was sporadic, and you weren't really sure what happened. But now you look around the entire Mediterranean basin, and it seems that it's going on. And this is an ancient artifact of a libellus. it says here, Christians were actively sought out by requiring public sacrifice. You make a pinch and you say, Kaiser Kyrios, or Caesar is Lord. And you could buy libelly, or a libelus, singular, libelly, plural, instead of sacrificing. But it was a forgery, basically, is what you were doing. Is that you would buy this forgery that you had actually made the pinch, or you could get the libelus by actually pinching. And there were martyrdoms of the heads of Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch during that time. But there was a big controversy with those that actually lapsed into buying the libelus during this period of time. Does anybody have any kind of recollection of reading through in church at all about this event? What do you guys remember about it? Yeah, Mike.
They wouldn't allow those people to come back. There were like a few things that church could, you couldn't come back. Sexual morality, apostasy. So these people who bought these things were a third of the church or something like that.
Yeah, there was a good bit of them during this period of time, and there were a couple different people in Rome that were involved. Cyprian got involved as well during this to see whether they would be let back in or not, the lapsed. Right. And in Rome, one of the presiding bishops was Novatian, I believe, and there were two camps in Rome at this time that were lenient and strict. The strict camp said, "You're never coming back." Does anybody remember what the lenient camp said?
10 years.
10 years. If you really repent, and you really have contrition, then you can come back in 10 years. And that's the liberal side of the church at the time.
Well,
That's a rather rigorous faith. During this time, Cyprian publishes the Unity of the Church. Very important document. And if you were to pick a primary source document to read that might give you a little bit of insight in how the church ended up looking Romanized or Catholicized, this would be a good one to read. It's easily accessible in the early church fathers, or really just Googling it, really. One of the great statements that he makes is, you cannot have God as your father if you don't have what? You may remember? The church as your mother. And he says what some others will say too, there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. Catholic simply means universal at this point in time. During the Valerian persecutions, Cyprian in 258 is martyred. Initially he survived, but the next one, he did actually remain bold through all of this, and he is martyred. Now, I want you to notice the timeline. So we'll have a quick stop over at Antony of the Desert in a minute here. And he's the first of these hermits, the very first wave of those that go out, and have a bit of foreshadowing for the monasticism that will come in the Middle Ages, a way that people tried to preserve Christianity. But see here from 258, and then you have this mention of Anthony giving up his possessions, taking up a life of solitude in the desert. This is a picture of him kind of fighting the wild beasts. He had visions and fastings and a lot of wild stuff that went on. People would come out to him for advice. But again, here's 258, and then we really don't have much that goes on until 303. And it is actually during this period of time that after the empire-wide persecutions, there does seem to be a bit of abatement of persecution. Some of the things that but then in 303, Diocletian orders the most severe persecutions ever under Roman emperors. The numbers vary. Of course, those that are in the Christian camp will have a very large number because it's more inspiring. Those that are detractors of Christianity have a much smaller number because they don't want it to be inspiring. But it's in the many, many thousands of those that were persecuted unto death. In some cases, there are early accounts of entire villages that were known to be Christian, completely wiped out during this time of the kind of a pogrom of extinction there. During this time, the very first Christian state is established. It is Armenia. Any Armenians? No? Mike? No?
Arminians.
Okay. You're swarthy. I think you can go either way, really.
He's Brazil.
And then, again, we're in the midst of 303 to 313 with the quietness of persecution from 258 all the way until 303, almost 50 years. Something happened during the church during that period of time. It became soft. And they became influenced by worldly desires. And the edge and the holiness of the church lost its edge during that period of time. And at just the moment where all seemed the most lost, a heroic figure, a white knight, rises up over the hill, trumpets blow, and there's a sign in the sky, and the great Constantine reads, En tutu nika, in Greek, or in hoc signo vinces, or by this sign conquer. And everything changes forever in Christianity at that moment. He says, by this sign conquer, so he makes this sign or this standard, the very sign or standard that he puts into the hands of his army as they go into battle. And as they go into battle, they gain great victory at Milvan Bridge, and he attributes it to Christ, and he then adopts Christianity. We don't know if he does so out of superstition or out of real devotion, but either way, it is the end of all persecution. The Edict of Milan is soon put, the conversion of Constantine, not really his conversion. Do you know when he was baptized? On his last breath. It seems as though he had like a little trough waiting for him. That, all right, you have one breath left, kush, all right, it's done. And off he goes. It was pretty much something like that. But everything ends everything ends in persecution at this time, except for schismatic groups. They now start to get persecuted. The Donatists are concerned about the holiness of the church. Where are they? They're in Carthage. They're in North Africa. They're those rigorous folks. They're not Montanist, but they are rigorous nonetheless, because it just seems like certain areas of the world kind of promote that idea a bit more than others. And again, there's a rigorousness about the faith of the Donatists, and they say, what has Christ to do with Caesar? And that was their banner by which they were known. And as such, they felt like, what are we doing getting in bed with the emperor? And they ended up having such a split that they actually broke away, and they were actually persecuted by the church. Or the church requested Constantine to intervene with arms. And they would burn down the church of the Donatists, and there'd be reactions. A very ugly time of what happened soon after this. During this time is also the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan may not have actually been an actual edict. It could have just simply been, it's actually just mentioned in letters of one church to another. We don't actually have an Edict of Milan that we can look to as archaeological evidence. Better just to call it at this point in time the Edict of Toleration. And by the Edict of Toleration, Galerius, who was the main persecutor from 303 to 312, an advisor to Diocletian, signs the Edict of Toleration and effectively stops all Christian persecution. Moving on just a little bit more. During this period of time, where there is peace, tranquility, but also softness, Arius begins teaching about Jesus. And he has a jingle that he uses as he teaches. And it influenced many. And his jingle was, anybody know? There was a time when the sun was not. And then Athanasius, who takes up the battle against him after Alexander gives his best shot at it, has his retort. And he also has a jingle. There was not a time where the sun was not.
That's clever. That's cutting edge.
And they kind of fought each other with sound bites, but they also fought each other with deep theology as well. Athanasius takes up the fight against Arianism from 320 until 376. Wow. Does anybody know the tagline by which Athanasius went by, what he wrote about himself in Latin? Athanasius contra mundum. Athanasius against the world. He felt as though he was going against the entire Christian world because so much of the church seemed to have gone into camp with Arian. And ultimately, during this period of time is when Eusebius writes from Caesarea, and he writes the ecclesiastical history. A lot of the very early church information that we have comes from Eusebius. It's not direct quotes or direct documents from the 100s or 200s. It's actually Eusebius gaining what he could at the time. All those documents are gone, but he captured them, and so we have them through kind of the other link in the chain. Well, anyway, this Athanasius, Alexander versus Arius fight, flames on. Homoousis. It is the reason for the first ecumenical council, the first worldwide council. And it's the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. 336, the very first Christmas is celebrated. There is a guy named St. of time and attended the Council of Nicaea. Eusebius dies in 340, but he does capture the great history before he does so. Athanasius writes an Easter letter in 367, and in that letter reaffirms the 27 books of the New Testament, and it's the last of the discussion on the issue at this point in time. Council of Nicaea dealt with it. The Muratorian canon was the first reaction to it, but it began back with Marcion. After this, we have Ambrose, Jerome, and ultimately Augustine, that all come on the scene at the end of the 300s. We'll take a break right now for a minute, and then Debbie's going to talk to us about the women martyrs of the early church. Let's go. All right, so going to take a break until about 11:20.
So, Hebrews.
It was contested.
It's not my morning.
Yeah. Apocalypse. Yeah. Yeah. Sure thing.
What's that?
See if I've been able to. What's the temperature? 63! Yes! Yes! I think it's only due to us expending our body heat.
Right here.
I don't hear any sort of HVAC noise at all.
That's okay.
We're generating
I'm
that
wide
sound
awake.
just by our electronics.
Yeah. Ed, did
Yes.
you get these slides online for the one